It's going to be a bumpy night.
Don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing.
So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore.
I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore.
I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore.
Well, we are just about 6 months to the November presidential election. It seems like we have been dealing with the chaos in our justice system, whether it be state court, federal court, for months now. We've been hearing about these federal crimes, the raids at Mar-a-Lago, the case in Georgia, the case in New York, whether it be documents or January 6th or whatever, whether the civil stuff, E. Jean Carroll, etc., etc. You guys have been hearing about court and about Trump and about law, all kinds of craziness. And we are going to kind of bring everything up to date today. We're going to kind of go over where we are in New York with that case, big testimony last week with Stormy Daniels, and before that, all kinds of interesting testimony. They're looking forward to Michael Cohen's testimony. Let's see what he has to say. And so all of that New York stuff, the Alvin Bragg case, that's developing. But big breaking news in the classified documents case coming out of, I guess, Fort Myers area, in that federal case in Florida, or Flaaaarida, as my New York viewers say. Lots going on, especially, and even with the Fani Willis case, with whether or not she's going to be disqualified. That's an appeals court. There is so much going on that I needed to just kind of break everything down for you and invite in a good friend, fantastic lawyer. His name is Ryan Vesio. He was a 15-year prosecutor prosecuting homicides and crimes against children and sex trafficking, big cases here in the Central Florida area. He does civil litigation currently at the firm of Sheffield Lohman. He has political experience. He ran for state attorney. So this guy knows his stuff. And today we are going to invite him in to break down everything. So with that, let me welcome Ryan to the show. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks for having me, David. Looking forward to talking to you.
So before we brought you on, we've talked about, I guess it was yesterday, you and I were just chatting on the phone about something totally different. I said, hey, I'm going to ask your opinion on this. And we had a really interesting conversation. I said, holy cow, we have to get you on a show to talk about this. Because what I found really interesting, and this is important for the viewing audience here, is, and as my audience knows, we do a conservative political show. I tend to have conservative pundits on, whether they're surrogates from the Trump campaign, but I generally have people from the orbit of like thinkers. And you and I were talking, and you don't know, you're not necessarily a Trump supporter. You're sort of politically independent now in your life. You were a registered Democrat. You ran as a Democrat when you ran for state attorney. There's certain things you don't like about all of the political landscape. And so what I found really interesting about talking to you was, here is my chance to get a legal opinion, essentially, about everything that's going on without the bias, which is a really cool opportunity for the audience because everybody's really curious about what's going on. You could turn on your news and hear it a salacious hush money case, and you get all the bias, and then you hear the Republican pundits tell you their reasons on why it's a terrible case. I haven't seen many, honestly, liberal lawyers making any good cases for it, but they really want it to be a good case, but they try. And so what I'm hoping today is to give the audience a real objective legal analysis of everything that's going on, not just with the New York case, but what's happening right now with the classified documents case and the case in Georgia. I don't even know what we call that case. I can't even say with a straight face, a racketeering case in Georgia, but we're going to talk about that too. So let's jump right into the hush money case, which, by the way, I joke about all the time because hush money isn't a crime. They're calling it a hush money case because that sounds sexy and controversial. Really, it's a business records case because that's not exciting, right? We're joining now the business records case. So no, it's a hush money case. It's a case about hush money and interfering with the 2016 election with hush money because that sounds really bad, right? But none of that's the crime. So let's talk about what is the crime. What is President Trump being charged with in New York State? The people of New York State, really Alvin Bragg versus New York. What are they charging him with? What is the crime?
The essence of the allegation is that there was a improper campaign expenditure related to Trump's campaign that I guess you could call it the hush money or the quiet money or the payoff money in order to keep the Stormy Daniels secret locked behind closed doors until at least after the election. You know, the hush money term is interesting because you're exactly right. I mean, people have been paying people off for thousands of years to not say or do things. You know, one of the difficulties about these political code, election code type crimes is that legislators create them and then prosecutors have to define them and test them without any other guidance. You know, being a lawyer, I have the guidance of 200 years of case law that interprets what this means or that means. But unfortunately, most of these election cases come up for the first time, and it's the prosecutor who decides how they want to define it. So is it hush money? Is it an improper campaign expenditure? Is it a reporting violation? I don't know. I guess it's the same, you know, the multiple ways to say the same thing.
Yeah. And so this case, for the audience at home, for the non-lawyers, although there are a lot of internet experts lately, whether it's medicine or law, everybody who reads the internet seems to know a lot about everything anymore. So why do we need professionals? I don't know. You have AI and Google.
Kidding.
We don't need any of us anymore. So the internet lawyers, I'm sure they've looked it up, but for those of you who are not internet lawyers, basically this is New York penal law. I guess it's section 170.10, falsifying business records in the first degree. And that's what's been interesting about the fact that they're saying it's in the first degree. And I'm going to tell you this. So basically, a person is guilty of this if they falsify business records with the intent to defraud, make or cause false entry in the business records of an enterprise, blah, blah, blah. It could be any type of organization, etc. It's designed to protect the integrity of business records and prevent fraudulent activities that could harm individuals. And some of the examples that they note are instances where somebody retroactively went back and altered a record that showed somebody declined insurance in a rental car case. That's one of the big examples of it. So the idea here is you don't want businesses fraudulently messing with the records to screw somebody, essentially. So, you know, you go and whatever, you go to rent a car, and that's the example they use. No, I want the insurance. And then you get into a car accident. They go, oh, we're not covering you. You say, why? Oh, you declined the insurance. No, I didn't. I signed it. No, look, I have the business record right here. It said you declined it. When you commit fraud on that, that is what this is. That is the falsifying the business records in the first degree. When somebody fraudulently modifies something to take advantage of somebody, right? So they're trying to suggest that by paying any of these people and classifying it as a legal expense as opposed to a campaign expense, they're suggesting it was defrauding the American people before an election, right? And that there's a whole nother element to this, that their underlying crime element, and I'll get to that in a second. Mm-hmm. But the idea here that they're trying to claim is that here, what Trump did was he intentionally and was involved in all of this, by the way, willfully. What he did was he went and knowingly and willfully said, hey, you know what? Let's change this record. I want to get elected. So to make this say legal expense as opposed to campaign expense, because one, I don't want to go to jail for doing anything for a campaign finance violation. And the other thing, I want to get elected, and this will really hurt my chances of getting elected. So Michael Cohen, go out there, create a bunch of shell corporations, and I want you to modify all of this. Ha 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 ha. That's what they're saying, right?
There's so many layers to this, though. Leaving aside the I want to cover this up so I get elected piece, because I'm not sure that this story having gone live would have been the difference between election or not. Part of the theory presupposes that voters check expenditures and voters are looking at contributions. I'm going to guess that 90% of voters don't even know how to find those online. Now, a politics nerd like me, and especially getting to this time of year, I love looking at expenditures and contributions. But for this to be fraudulent, the prosecution is going to have to make that connection that we had to call it a legal expense and not a campaign contribution, because that's going to set off a red flag. And then people are going to start asking questions. So, the first part of the statute talks about intent. Intent crimes are the most difficult cases to prosecute because you can never truly get in the mind of somebody else. And we pick a jury of people who are not supposed to know the facts, that are supposed to come in with a clean slate, that only listen to the testimony. But in doing so, you're asking strangers to jump into, in this essence, the president's mind to say, what did he mean to do? I used to tell stories in closing arguments to juries. I used to take one of my kids' bathtub rubber ducks and set it on the jury box and say, well, what is this? If it looks like this and it talks like this, is it a duck? Yeah, it's probably a duck. But that's, in essence, what this case is going to come down to in court is, can you jump into the president's mind? It's, I think the other part of it, David, is I do agree, and having ran a campaign before, campaigns really are, in essence, businesses. I mean, you have revenue and expenditures, and you're managing PR and working on a product or things like that. So as it relates to the expenditures of a campaign or an associated business, I personally don't have any issue with that. I think it's getting down to, how can you prosecute an intent crime where there is more than one plausible explanation, at the very least, if not reasonable?
Well, yeah, and just on the political aspect of it, if we're going to prosecute people for falsifying business records, for basically promoting certain information and not promoting other information in order to increase your chances of being elected, I think you would literally have to charge everybody who ever ran for office at a high profile with this crime. Because, I mean, yes, money changed hands in order to suppress certain stories, but money changes hands to do all kinds of things. There's campaigns often make non-for-profit donations in order to get organizations out working for them and saying things nice or bad about. I mean, the way campaigns work, it's messy business. And we do have federal election laws. But interesting enough, in this quote-unquote hush money case, there was no federal election law violation that accused Donald Trump of breaking any laws. Now, Michael Cohen, he was convicted of illegal campaign contributions. This was a crime that he committed and was convicted on. Trump was never charged, was never investigated. There was literally zero argument from the federal government saying, hey, Trump, what you did here was bad. It was Michael Cohen, what you did here was bad. And it was in Michael Cohen, I guess, admitting to what he did on the record, where he said, well, this candidate told me to do XYZ, and I went and did XYZ. And also the other guy, Pecker, the guy from the National Enquirer, which, by the way, all the press keeps calling it the parent company instead of the National Enquirer, because everyone will roll their eyes and say, oh, the National Enquirer, that's your source? So they talk about the parent company of National Enquirer in all the stories I've read. But he said, oh, yeah, he was charged with campaign finance violations because he suppressed the story and he paid for it, because that was the relationship that they had with Cohen. Or there was some kind of weird exchange for money where None of this was Trump. It was all people around Trump, and Cohn was known to be the fixer. So and there's this idea of the underlying crime in this New York case that you had to have done, because the idea is this is falsifying business records to conceal an underlying crime. What's the underlying crime?
Well, so I will say this, that so much of the talk on this case, I think on the conservative side, and this is the New York trial, has been politically motivated. This is a politically motivated prosecution. It's a politically motivated investigation. And that's a whole nother topic that we can talk about. I think having prosecuted political corruption cases for about 7 or 8 years in my career, one of the biggest focuses for the prosecutor is bringing this case forward going to reek of political motivation so much that you're never gonna get anywhere. So I think on the federal side, if the Department of Justice had brought Donald Trump in as a co-defendant to the Cohen case or the Pecker case, I mean, candidly, that would have reeked of political gamesmanship so darn much that that case would have never gone anywhere. Not to say that the New York case is a slam dunk, but I think at a certain point, there has to be some realization of the federal government itself having charged the former president at that point in time under these facts, under the New York facts. Leave aside the DC Circuit case and the Cannon case. I just don't see how that could have realistically, viably ever come forward. Now, if I put on my pure prosecutor hat, and if I have facts to show that I made a payment to a third party in order to suppress a story coming out that could be damaging to my campaign, and I did it for that purpose, I actually do think that that could violate the FEC campaign finance law for improper notations and mischaracterization of expenditure. But at the time, we now know that there was also these parallel investigations between what Bragg was doing in Manhattan and what the DOJ was doing, and those just played out the way that they did.
So, going back to the election aspect and the campaign, it's also a crime if you use campaign funds for things that are not, well, it can be a crime depending on the level. If you use campaign money for things that are not campaign related, you look at the case against George Santos in New York. I mean, that's 100%. What they're saying is that he misappropriated campaign funds. If Trump was to put on a campaign finance report, payments to adult actresses / Playboy models to not tell people about our relationship, would the FEC have considered that a valid campaign expenditure?
Well, look, I mean, that's the exact scenario that happened in the John Edwards case so long ago. I mean, it was an expenditure to silence a part of his life that wouldn't have been favorable. And Edwards, for right or wrong, I'll let you decide, beat that case by making the argument that, oh, this is absolutely not an expenditure. This was to keep my family together and my marriage together. So thanks, but no thanks. It's not an expenditure. And ultimately, Edwards was acquitted of that. So, one of the things that when you talk about these expenditures on a candidate like President Trump, who is or has the ability to, in essence, self-fund his own campaign, at what point in time does the payment cross the line to be an expenditure? Now, anybody who runs for office is taught if you're going to give yourself money, you've got to report it as a loan or a contribution to yourself and segregate the money. But candidates don't work. They just don't work that way. And some of this, I think, is a situation where everybody does it about the same way that's running for office. And you got to be careful when you point out one person and say, I'm going to make the example of you because you've got to follow this to the letter. Because, to a point you made earlier, it opens Pandora's box of, okay, when the roles are reversed and the R majority is a D majority, or the D majority now is an R majority, now we're going to cannibalize each other, basically. So it just becomes this really vicious cycle.
Yeah. Well, especially when you get into the state court aspect of it. I mean, we have federal law that establishes when or when you can't charge an elected official, let alone a president of the United States. And there's a lot in place to kind of control abuse of that. But at state level, it's kind of the Wild West because, the pardon may or may not apply to a state conviction. So you have an aspect where states, rogue states, I mean, you could take a state like, I don't know, Alabama, when we have a Democratic president who might be like, well, I'm going to bring this person up in state charges, because what candidate doesn't cross into all 50 states when they're running for national? I mean, every candidate has set foot in almost every single state, unless you're Hillary Clinton and you avoid the Midwest during the 2016 campaign. Other than that, every candidate usually goes into every place, every state, and any prosecutor can somewhat legitimately bring a crime in those cases, depending on what activity occurred in those cases. And yeah, I mean, maybe they get thrown out, maybe they don't. But if you're a president of the United States, or at least a candidate for president of the United States, could you imagine if Republican states started just finding reasons to charge candidates for what could be legitimate crimes, and Democrats are, I mean, where does it end? And you're right, it's a very dangerous precedent, which is why I object so much to finding novel legal theories to go after former presidents and current presidential candidates. Because if it was an obvious crime, let's say Trump did commit a murder, an obvious murder, like he always says, I go to middle of Times Square, shoot somebody, and people still love me. Fine. Let's say he did that. That would be an obvious sort of situation, right? Nobody would be like, oh, this is a novel legal theory. It's murder. No, murder. If it's clear, we have evidence of it, fine, charge somebody. But we're talking about using loopholes in the law in some extent to kind of bring this in, to get around statutes of limitation, to suggest that there's an underlying crime, even though one wasn't charged or alleged by the federal government. But when you have to jump through hoops to put a president on trial, I just think it's so dangerous and damaging for our system of justice that really more deference should be used in bringing these cases. But more than that, when you have the prosecutors running on, quote unquote, getting Trump, when Alvin Bragg ran for state attorney, he said, I'm going to get Trump. When Letitia James ran for attorney general, she said, I'm going to get Trump. When Fani Willis ran for DA, she said, I'm going to get Trump. So when you tell people what you plan on doing, get Trump, and then the very first thing you do is you indict a former president, it kind of already reeks of impropriety. And then you start to put in all these crazy things like the Nathan Wade thing in Georgia with Fani Willis. We'll get to the classified documents case in Florida with all the mishandling of those documents, funny enough, by the government. And then you take this case in New York where literally, and we'll get into this testimony soon, where everything is just seemingly insane. It really starts to cast doubt. And I think, and we talked about this on the phone, that this is something that inevitably is going to help the president because of the public perception that it's an injustice, and which I think is the opposite of what they were hoping to accomplish. What do you think?
Well, I think there's four things there. On the loophole piece, I will propose a different perspective, respectfully, of course.
Sure, of course.
Is, there's always the first to anything. So when Al Shepard went up in the first Mercury rocket, all right, we built this thing, we created this thing, and now we're going to use this thing. I mean, the caveman who created the wheel, the first person who had Coca-Cola, all these things. I think in every situation there has to be a first, and when there is the first of something, there is no experience, really no guardrails. I mean, it's just let the rocket loose and go. And I think when you deal with these election code violations, they are extremely seldomly prosecuted, especially in the intent with campaign finance piece. So what you have is you do have this case being brought under New York state law that has not been well defined. It hasn't been tested by the courts. We haven't had appellate courts who have looked at the trials of the past and said, prosecutor, you got it right or you got it wrong, or defense, you got it right or you got it wrong. So, you're litigating into the dark. Now that happens not all the time, but it happens more frequently than people would realize. It is a tough hill to climb when you're going to take the car out for the first time, and the car is the most expensive car in the world, driving down the Las Vegas Strip with every car lover in the world watching it, which,
Right.
I mean, that's what the case is here. So, you know, I'm not sure that so much to me, I don't think it's so much loopholes or, you know, things like that. It is a novel prosecution, but it's novel because it's the first time it's been brought. You know, you talked about people like Bragg and Fannie running on a platform of, you know, going after President Trump. This is the inherent problem when you have prosecutors who are politicians. We deal with this in some states with judges. I'm licensed here in Florida. Judges are appointed, and then through the merit, confirmation process or merit retention process, we keep them around after the fact, but it's nonpartisan. I'm licensed to practice law in Ohio. Those are partisan judicial elections, and some of the same things you see with the prosecutors running, you see in some of these states where R's and D's are running on a ballot. It does beg the question of how can you insulate lead prosecutors from being so political. And you and I both know this with watching local politics, even county commission races that are nonpartisan. Everybody knows who the Democrat person is, and everybody knows the Republican person. You know, from my experience, there are good, responsible district attorneys and state attorneys can put mechanisms in to try to insulate the political part of it by walling themselves off, not being involved in the prosecution, going through your office and knowing the personalities, knowing that this person is very conservative, this person is somewhat liberal. Let's put them both together on a case to work it through and let them make the decision, as opposed to me as the elected official, so to speak. You know, I think the other thing, and we talked about this yesterday, is the whole perception of prosecutions. So in this instance, if this is a politically motivated prosecution by Democrats to try to knock down President Trump, they didn't think it through very well, because what we're seeing out there is the Republican base, and I think even a little bit more than just Trump supporters, are really rallying behind this now 3-week long judicial parade, so to speak, where Trump's base is fortifying, and it is asking additional questions about, are liberal prosecutors using their office for ways that are inconsistent with why their office exists? So sometimes you can't think through how things are going to play out in the end, but this one is pretty straightforward. And I think no matter what happens, you have a situation to where if any of this is to influence the election, it's going to influence it in the wrong way. If I'm a Democrat and not wanting the president to be reelected for that. The other thing is this, to your point of state laws going rogue, and you know, for every Colorado or Maine that you have that tried to keep the president off the ballot, there were other conservative states that would never entertain it. The founders could not have ever envisioned in Independence Hall a scenario where you had some states of the union going after federal politicians or political figures. They could have never envisioned that this would happen. And it's a complete no man's land as to what the final effect to this is. I put on my legal nerd hat and geek out over these constitutional questions, because you're right. If Bragg gets what he wants and Trump is convicted, can he pardon himself? Well, we've never had that instance. We have certain precedent that federal pardons don't apply to state convictions, but that's never been tested before. What if the case is on appeal and the president is now, if President Trump is elected and his case is on appeal and he's got a jail sentence over his head, well, there's a plethora of case law that says that an active president can't be involved in a criminal matter. So does this case go on pause until the end of his next term? I mean, there are just so many uncertainties before we even get to the U.S. Supreme Court wrestling with the notion of presidential immunity. I mean, it is a complete no man's land out there.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Hey friends, David Pollack here. If you're craving the best soft serve ice cream around, Topper's Creamery's got you covered. Serving the Apopka community for over a decade, Topper's is known for the finest old-fashioned custard-style soft-serve ice cream in a variety of flavors, from their French vanilla bean to exciting specials like German chocolate cake. But the experience doesn't end there. Be sure to grab a fresh baked waffle cone or a sundae topped with my favorite, the fresh baked brownies. They even offer pup cups for your four-legged friends. So hurry in to Topper's Creamery in Apopka, South 512 Hunt Club Road. Make sure to tell them David sent you.
With today's economic environment, it's never been more important to secure your hard-earned wealth for you and your family's future. FinSec Life works to offer industry-leading customer service to help successful individuals and businesses protect their wealth. Whether it's a business succession plan, estate liquidity, or a variety of life and long-term care policies, FinSec Life can help deliver peace of mind, knowing that if something happens, you or your company is taken care of. Visit finseclife.com. That's FINSEC life.com. Securities offered through Valmark Security Inc., member FINRA and SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Valmark Advisors Inc., an SEC-registered investment advisor. FinSec Life is a separate entity from Valmark Securities Inc. and Valmark Advisors Inc.
Business owners, are you sick of dealing with those big-name telecommunications companies that leave you frustrated with terrible customer service and then lock you into long-term contracts? That's why I want to introduce you to my friends over at Public Telephone Company. They are an industry-leading VoIP provider offering all-in-one business communication solutions that are completely contract-free with competitive pricing. But perhaps the best part, they're all about supporting their customers with US-based customer service, and they're always willing to go the extra mile. Don't let your phone company drive you mad. Call Public Telephone Company today at 877-314-4080 or visit them at publictelephonecompany.com. That's publictelephonecompany.com.
Hello, Patriots, listen up. It's time to wake up and smell the freedom. Beard Vet Coffee is here to fuel your American spirit. This isn't just coffee. It's a battle cry in a cup, a declaration of love for the land of the free and the home of the brave. Crafted by the hands of those who've walked the walk, talked the talk, and, grown the damn beard. Vet-founded, vet-focused, and beard-operated. This is coffee with a mission, a purpose, and a testament to the unyielding American spirit. It's a tribute to the tireless resolve that courses through the veins of our great nation. This is the taste of victory, the flavor of freedom, the coffee that stands as firm as our belief in America's destiny to lead and never to kneel. Beard Vet Coffee is more than a brand. It's a legacy steeped in the principles that make America great. It's for those who stand with pride under the stars and stripes, who uphold the values that light the torch of liberty for the world to see. So, are you ready to supercharge your day the American way? Beard Vet Coffee is not just a choice. It's a declaration of independence from mediocre mornings. Bold, brave, unbound. Brewed for the American patriot. Beard Vet Coffee. Make your mornings great again.
Yeah, it is. And it's a big distraction, honestly, from what voters would typically be considering this time of year. And that's, whether you think somebody's record supports their ability to be a good candidate and / president, their past records, what they're starting to do, their plans, programs. I don't think we've talked about anything in this entire presidential primary / election that has to do with really policies at all. It's all been what they're accusing Trump of, the trials. It has been just the civil cases. There really has been no vetting of Trump's actual record by the media. It's vetting his personality and his reputation. And the interesting part of that is all of that has been litigated prior to the 2016 election. So at the end of the day, and like we've mentioned, I think all of this prosecution only helps President Trump because none of this information is new to people. People knew about this Stormy Daniels situation. They knew about the Access Hollywood tape. Remember, it went out everywhere. Everybody saw it. So suppressing this didn't, and that goes back to the argument we talked about with John Edwards before, is if everybody knew about it anyway, suppressing it wouldn't have made a difference to the election. So purely, it probably is. You could make the argument to not embarrass his family. And there is some, I don't know if it was testimony or if it was written, I forget where I saw it, but somebody stated that Trump was worried this would embarrass his family and wanted it kind of kept out of the media because he is very protective over his family. He doesn't want certain things in the media or things about his family in the media, which would go to this being a legal expense and not a campaign expense. And of course, all of that will go in front of a jury and we'll see. But I think at the end of the day, and I want to get into this testimony here in a second, I think at the end of the day, even if he is convicted and all those other interesting legal aspects of it that we talked about, I think at the end of the day, this most likely would be overturned anyway because of all of the kind of insane evidence that has been allowed to be shown in order to prove the intent element, because that's what you said, it's hard to prove intent here. So they've had to bring in a lot of flamboyant type of evidence to show the intent and how embarrassing this information was. It was so embarrassing. Look at this tape. Look at this former porn star. Look at this former playmate. Look at all this horrible information. That clearly shows his intent, because anybody else this getting out would destroy him, except for the fact that all of this stuff basically was out already.
Well, but I think that there's another part to this, David. And to me, this case this trial's played on in a way where I don't want to call Trump. I don't, people think that Trump's a lot of things. In opening statements, Trump's team gave the argument that this never happened, that the encounter with Daniels never happened. And that's sort of like a bully taunting somebody on a schoolyard. The problem is once you put that into play, you've completely opened the door to now having prosecutors, giving them the ability to say, nope, this is exactly what happened. And judge, we have to go through all the details of what type of pajamas he was wearing because they have said it never happened. Now, it brings up an interesting dynamic that happens in lots and lots of cases, which is, I think strategically, had Trump gone from the very beginning and said, I wanted to keep this for my wife, I wanted to keep this for my family, I'm extremely protective over them, I think a lot of jurors would, although they wouldn't agree with what happened, they could understand that the rationale was reasonable. And those, but that takes a defendant that's got fortitude to sit there and admit something that they did was wrong or unpopular or immoral, all of those things. So it is a difficult place to where Trump put Daniels into play and the veracity of her account into play. And they did get slapped pretty hard by some of that testimony. Now, I agree with whoever analyst you're watching, whether it's Fox or MSNBC. Yeah, the Daniels testimony had about 30 minutes of actual relevance to the case, arguably 30 minutes, although she went on for, I think, 10 or 12 hours. But that's what these trials become, is they become, you talked about it, you opened the door, now I'm going to jump through it. Now, you did have the piece from the trial judge talking about the limitations as to the specifics of the actual alleged encounter that prosecutors did really push the envelope on. And I do think they probably pushed a little too far. So it's going to create an issue for appeal. It's going to create a really interesting issue for appeal. And what happens sometimes in those types of situations is the appellate court could overturn the case and send it back for new trial just because of the prejudicial nature of evidence and never even touch the question of, was there intent, what the underlying crime is, which I think is, what's really relevant here.
Yeah, it is very interesting to see. And if it did get sent back for a new trial, by then, arguably, Trump might be president.
Who knows at that point?
And we're already going back to 2016, by the way. This isn't 2020. This is 2016. This is ancient. This is almost 10 years old at this point. It's insane. But Let me ask you. So now everybody's talking about this week the Cohen testimony, right? Their star witness. I mean, we've had every witness is a star witness, right? Every day it's like this is the star witness. Now here's Cohen, what kind of gave birth to all of this. Now Cohen, who's been convicted of not only campaign finance violation, he also defrauded financial institutions. He committed tax fraud. He's not an honest guy, right? And inside Trump world, he was known to be sort of a rogue kind of agent doing what he thought was right. And he was also an attorney who, did things on behalf of Trump. But he's the one who opened up these businesses that paid these people. Trump just signed the checks. So what do you think is going to come out of Cohen's testimony? Do you think Cohen's testimony is inevitably going to be really damaging for the prosecution? Or do you think it's going to be damaging for Trump? Because at the end of the day, I don't know how Trump's team doesn't pick him apart and make him look like the biggest liar on the planet. Considering his record alone.
Yeah, I think most of that's going to depend upon how the prosecution presents him.
No.
If they hold Cohen to be this virtuous team player and I took the directives from the boss and I just did what he did, if they present him like that, it's going to be a dumpster fire for him. Yeah. As you said, the reality is this. Cohen manipulated, Cohen lied, Cohen did the dirty work. But candidly, lots of people don't want to ever see sausage being made, but they sure as heck love it at the ballpark or in biscuits and gravy on Sunday morning. And this is a peek into the dirty underbelly of business and politics. And the Cohens of the world exist. Lots of people know them. I'm going to say that most successful businesses or operations have a Cohen-like figure, maybe not to his extreme. And Cohen has pled guilty to his crimes. He has served his sentence. He deserves to be out and free because he's completed his sentence, and that's the criminal justice system. But they can't hold him out to be this virtuous person. Now, having had witnesses like this before when I prosecuted cases, the most important thing, and this is why the DA has taken so long to build this case to get to Cohen, the DA, if they're smart, will not rely upon anything that Cohen says that doesn't have a second source of verification. Now, this is where so much of the testimony, even this past Friday, was dealing with phone records. And gosh, this is the most, just grueling, boring stuff in the world. What I think you're going to see prosecutors try to do is Cohen's going to say, I had a conversation with Mr. Trump the day before the check was issued. And we talked on the phone. And then the prosecutor is going to say, here's the Verizon record that shows the call from here to here. Now, that doesn't completely give Cohen credibility as to recall a conversation that's not recorded. But those little things, I think, will help. The other thing that I think is going to be really intriguing to see is how far the prosecution pushes Cohen's testimony. Because if they tried this case simply, and to the allegation that we talked about before, it is there was a conversation to make a payment to Daniels from Cohen that Trump would reimburse. Anything outside of that, I think you start getting into no man's land to where a good cross-examiner they're going to be a sniper, and they're just going to pick apart here and pick apart here and pick apart here, and then ultimately turn to a jury and say, look, he didn't make sense on all of these items of his testimony, which is fine. And what happens is the 10 pieces of relevant testimony that somebody gives is often outweighed or outshadowed by the 50 parts of irrelevant testimony to where they maybe weren't honest, or they were impeached, or they were showed to be confused. So the temptation is to make it as big as possible, the whole star witness piece, like you said. But these high-profile cases against high-profile defendants, it's so hard for the prosecution to get out of their head and just go back to keep it simple, stupid. So, it is sometimes the perception of needing to put on a show just outweighs good legal judgment and get in, get out with as few shots as possible.
So I want to wrap up the New York case and turn about some of these other cases. What do you think, though? I want to get your prediction. And I know you'll. I've predicted. I think Trump's going to get convicted because maybe I'm biased and partisan. I think Trump's going to get convicted just because I don't think from the outset this case was really ever about the law. I mean, that's what I believe. You know, you've articulated some very good reasons why they could bring the case and why he could be found guilty or not guilty. I get it. I think it's a political case from the get-go. I feel like jury selection was problematic. I know we have jurors that were seated that said they had a negative feeling about Trump, but they could be impartial. There's a couple of lawyers on the jury. I'm worried that no matter what, Trump will be convicted because none of this is based in actual law. It's based in emotion and hatred for a former president. So I feel like there will be an emotional conviction. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, there have been hated defendants, Casey Anthony being one of them, O.J. Simpson being another, who have been acquitted. So there is a potential that the world could be shocked, and even a jury that hates the defendant acquits them based on a really poor case. And maybe those two jurors that are attorneys, maybe they overthink it to the benefit of justice. I don't know. What do you think's going to happen? What's your prediction?
So if I'm playing roulette, I'm betting on 0 here for a hung jury. And here's why. It is so hard to convince 12 people to agree beyond a reasonable doubt to anything. I mean, if you've got 11 friends at your house and you're deciding what are we going to have for dinner tonight, it's hard to convince everybody with conviction to go have Thai food or go have Mexican or something along those lines. That's what the prosecution's got to do here. They got to convince every one of those 12 jurors that a crime was committed and that Donald Trump was the one who committed that crime in whole or part. I do find it hard to believe that they're going to get to a verdict either way. Now, what the jury is going to be instructed is the verdict has to be unanimous. So if you have 10 people back there that want to convict and you have 2 that don't want to convict, under the law, that's a verdict of not guilty. Now, when you get hung jurors, is you get those deliberations where people just won't come off their position. So I do think it's likely that there are people on this jury that wanted to be on this jury because of a strong opinion for or against President Trump. I think once you get back in that jury room and those people start going back and forth, especially if they start talking about what are the motivations for this, people are not going to come off their positions. And I would be shocked because I do think more jurors than not would want to find him guilty. I would be shocked if those jurors who wanted to find him guilty were willing to come off of that to all agree that a non-unanimous verdict is a verdict of not guilty. And I think the last part to it is there's a difference between being innocent and not guilty. And that to me is going to be the line here. So I think they're going to deliberate for 3 or 4 days. I think that they're going to hang. And then at that point, you're going to completely be into, July and September. And I would find it extremely hard to believe that the court would retry this case in October. I mean, there's your ultimate test of how politically motivated this whole thing is. But I bet
they would. Well, we'll see, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, hung jury. I'll put you down for hung jury, and we'll revisit that as this goes on.
That sounds good.
But now let's turn, because this isn't the only case, right? So, which is crazy. This was just the first one. Which, by the way, a lot of legal experts on the left said, I wish they wouldn't have brought this case because we have so many better cases out there that why bring this one, right? But this is the one they're doing, which makes me think that these other ones may not do what they hoped it would do. Let's go first to Miami because, well, technically Fort Myers where the case is being heard, I guess. But that is the classified documents case. And for everybody familiar with it, they're basically saying that Trump mishandled classified documents, brought them to an unsecured location being Mar-a-Lago. And then once they were demanded to be returned, he didn't return them. He was raided. They took them. They found classified documents in places that weren't secured. He shouldn't have had them. There's a lot of arguments being made about whether or not he had the right to retain those, whether he had the right to, whether they were classified or declassified. There's a whole bunch of legal stuff. But the biggest thing to come out of this, outside of immunity and everything else, the biggest thing to come out of this is Judge Cannon, the judge. People are making a big deal. She's a Trump-appointed judge, but I don't believe it matters who appoints who. Judges tend to disappoint their parties, and we've seen this before. But this judge essentially has now indefinitely postponed this case in light of, and Jack Smith has gotten himself into trouble a lot about this, by the way, of not being upfront with this judge, whether it was the grand jury that they were relying upon and what jurisdictions they were, the evidence that was they had or didn't have, or the way it was maintained or not maintained. And I think one of the biggest ones was the fact that because of the sensitivity of the classified documents, what the FBI said and what Jack Smith said is that they put placeholders in. They photographed the evidence, which was the judge's instruction. But rather than put the evidence back where it was and document all of this, they put it out of order. Instead, they put it in the order of which they took pictures of it. And the pictures that they used, the ones that the media had, were actual placeholders that weren't actually, that said classified documents. That wasn't actually in the boxes. That was the placeholders that the government put in there to kind of note where they took documents from. But now we have a significant custody issue of those classified documents. What happened between the time they were taken, gone through, put back together? They've admitted they put them back together out of order. So if the basis of their case is mishandling of classified documents, and now those documents have been mishandled by the government itself, how do you prove a case? How do you show who mishandled what at this point? What documents were there, not there? Were they in those boxes? Were they on the floor? Did you put those classified documents in there? How do you know that the documents you have now were in those boxes?
Well,
right?
Yeah, it is. And I think there's a distinction here between, to get to the argument of whether the government manipulated or did something to the documents to change what they were or their significance. I think the Trump defense has got to get over the threshold of the documents being in existence at Mar-a-Lago in the first place was appropriate. I think if the government, if they can't overcome that, and if the government's successful in saying those records should not have been on property in any way, shape, or form, then I think the placeholders and all of that, it's a smart defense to go after, but I'm not sure that that's going to ultimately win the day. So the issue of the Presidential Records Act and what could be, classified, declassified, the manner of that, what could be taken, what could not be taken, were there reasons behind that? To me, that's sort of the meat of the case. And I think that the court is thinking of things differently than maybe the prosecution is and the defense, which happens. I think to your point on the political appointment piece, it always does raise a concern for people that are on the other side. I mean, I will say from my experience, judges who are appointed by a political system I don't believe they have loyalty to the person, but more loyalty to the ideology. So I do think, I have seen a number of judges, appointed by conservatives that have a more, their foundation is more of conservative thought or liberal thought. But I mean, that was, labeled to John Roberts, and you've seen what Chief Justice Roberts has done in lots of opinions where he's been on both sides of it. I think the piece of how the government and how the FBI handled the documents, I'm not sure that it wins the day, but it does make them look really awful in court. If that case ever gets to trial, then Trump's attorneys are going to point out every single time where they violated protocol or did this or did that wrong, and are going to stand in front of a jury and say, if they couldn't even get the documents and the handling of evidence right, what else did they mess up that we don't know? Does that create a reasonable doubt? It's a pretty good argument. Yeah. I will say that out of all the Trump cases, I think the Cannon case, the Mar-a-Lago case, I think it's the strongest prosecution case that they have. But when you have something that I think is fundamentally sound, you got to really be careful not to screw it up for yourself. And the government is not doing any favors to itself. But I still don't think it's going to, be defeating in the end or get the case dismissed.
Yeah, the Supreme Court, I think, is going to end up being the final arbiter of those cases in the January 6th case, which I think is that's a whole nother we'll talk about that another time. But yeah, so I do think Supreme Court's going to have something to say in that. I don't think Trump being in possession of those classified documents, being former president of the United States, and the fact that he didn't have a presidential library, and the fact that he was told he had to come pick up your documents, what are you going to do with them? Mm-hmm. And he's brought them. And then Mar-a-Lago arguing it's not a secure location when it's probably one of the most secured buildings in the whole world. The former president is there with 24-hour Secret Service protection. It's not like, it was just sitting in a Corvette in somebody's basement somewhere. Yeah. So it's going to be a lot. And again, this tying it to the business records thing too, is you have to convince a jury that the president of the United States, not just the president of the United States, but then Donald Trump, a billionaire who has a lot of people working for him. He has staff to do everything. He has staff to do literally everything. He doesn't do anything himself except for go on camera and, hand out food at restaurants on campaign stops, right? The rest of the time, people are doing things for him. So to make an argument that Trump himself directed all of these people to go and get those documents, bring them here, put them here. He wasn't relying on any attorney's advice on, no, of course, keep them here because we don't have anything else to do with them. No, Mr. President, you don't have to turn those over. The Presidential Records Act say you don't have to. Again, this is criminal we're talking about. The intent element that he did all of this himself because he's some kind of criminal mastermind that wanted to sell secrets to Russia. I don't know how they're going to be able to present that in trial. Now, it's easy to present in the media, which I think is the point of all of this, is to convince people who are Google attorneys that Trump is a bad guy because of XYZ. Look, he mishandled classified documents. Look, he paid off porn stars. Look, he's such a bad guy. He called Georgia and wanted to ask about the election. He's a bad dude. You shouldn't vote for him because of all these crimes he's charged with. That's the argument they're making. But I think at the end of the day, to suggest that Trump is running around masterminding this criminal enterprise and carrying boxes around Mar-a-Lago and placing them in places and rummaging through them and saying, these are classified, I'm keeping these. I don't think anybody in their right mind is going to believe that he single-handedly did all that. There's going to be teams of people who said, well, yeah, this is how we handled these documents because we had nowhere else to put them. And yes, they demanded him. But at that point, he was under investigation. And he said, I'm not going to turn these over to you if you're investigating. He had a right to retain them. And he believed he did. And so all of these things, I think are going to be very significant in the long run. Let me ask you your prediction on this one. What happens with the classified documents case? Do you think it ever goes to trial? Do you think he's president and it goes away? He pardons himself and they don't bother. He fires Jack Smith. What's the end result of this one?
I see two scenarios. I think if President Trump is reelected in November, then this case is going to get buried deep, deep, deep in the Atlantic Ocean. It is never going to surface. And there's going to be there's no remedy against it. I mean, President Trump is a lot of things, but when he makes his mind up on something, I mean, he's got conviction. And, obviously he's got, if he's reelected president, he has ultimate power and authority. So, and because he's going to be serving his second term, who cares what people think? I mean, I don't think he cares what people thinks now, but, so I think if he's elected, none of the federal cases go to court. They're just going to get dumped. And I think that even if those cases are paused during a second term for Trump, I just don't see, well, let me rephrase. Democrats would be idiots to go and unpause something that had been on pause for 4 years based upon something that had happened even further. I think the Democratic Party is not doing any justice to itself of the of this just indignation of Trump, because I think that very few people are in the middle to really influence on these cases. Now, I think if Trump is not elected, I do think that case ultimately goes to trial. And I think it's impossible to predict the trial right now because this case was so complicated to try. So yes, there is an intent element to these types of offenses. So if you take what's been reported as the attack on Iran plans, and it's all top secret SCI and code word and all of that. If I'm trying that case, I'm going through and pulling witnesses that will say that Trump was bragging about the plans to attack, and I'm going to pull, Truth Social and Twitter tweets and campaign stuff. And anytime he mentions the word Iran, I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to go to a jury and say, look, this is a circumstantial evidence case. Those are really, really hard. And given the breadth of the documents that are there, it could take you a year to put on a case like that. I think getting a jury for that case is going to be way harder than it was in Manhattan, because you've got everything, as you pointed out, from Fort Pierce to Key West for a jury pool, which is about as diverse of a jury pool as you get in this country, is in the Southern District. So I think it's too early to tell what happens if it goes, but I think it's more likely than not it'll probably never get to trial in an opening statement.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Not to mention the fact that we haven't even heard from the Supreme Court on whether or not the president can unilaterally and subjectively declassify something just by the very nature of him holding it up and saying, look what Iran's about to do. He could be declassifying that, and it's his discretion under the Constitution to do that. And so the Supreme Court has to speak on that too, because that, just by him taking those documents to Mar-a-Lago, you can argue was declassifying them.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is what gets interesting for lawyers, is we have a Constitution that could have never reasonably envisioned that question right there. And how do we deal with this now on the declassification piece? The Supreme Court would only be relevant for the court to determine after a conviction and after the appeals on the criminal conviction process. So you could have somebody who was, you could have President Trump who was convicted, and then it goes through the 3-year appeal process to get to the Supreme Court, where it's going to sit for another year. It's 2028 before the Supreme Court comes down and either upholds the conviction or not. So these things are not going away soon. So get your popcorn out and make sure to stretch.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, well, let's go to Georgia then before we conclude here. Fani Willis, probably one of the most corrupt prosecutions I've ever seen in my life, and I've watched what Jack Smith has tried to do and Alvin Bragg. So here we have a prosecution in Georgia. Now, we have a whole presidential immunity argument here now, and the fact that he was president of the United States at the time after an election, duty to uphold the Constitution and ensure fair and free elections, calls the state attorney in Georgia, essentially, calls the governor, calls everybody with a team of lawyers, not just him, a host of people who are saying, Mr. Trump, a lot of things happen in Georgia. We have questions. And so he calls. We've all heard the tape. Now, we've heard snippets of the tape. I actually listened to the whole stupid transcript where they were talking about a lot of things. Hey, can I send my lawyers down there to review some things? There's some questions about ballots. There's some questions about what happened. You can sit down with my lawyers. We can all sit down together. Let's see if we can find those votes, because the election hangs in the balance, essentially what he was saying. And you have a duty to ensure that, no, Mr. President, we're confident of it. Look, if you're confident of it, let me send my people down there if you're so confident of it, because we have legitimate questions, right? So based on that interaction, later, now, many years later, President Trump is now the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, decides he's running. Fani Willis, who ran on an election of getting Trump, comes in office, and what does she do? She charges the president, his lawyers, people in his orbits, Rudy Giuliani, people like Mark Meadows, everybody essentially, of essentially racketeering, but mob crimes, essentially. She's alleging Trump to be this mob boss who directed all of these corrupt public officials to steal an election in Georgia. And that's what he's being charged with, essentially, serious crimes. And then we find out, of course, she's trying to be objective, and this wasn't politically motivated at all, despite the fact she goes to Washington, D.C., supposedly meets with the Biden administration. Maybe that did or didn't happen. That's arguable, and I guess evidence will be presented to question it one way or the other. Then she hires, quote-unquote, a special prosecutor to look objective. The special prosecutor happens to be a boyfriend of several years who they've exchanged money, which she denied. Then that ends up going to court. And in probably one of the most interesting testimony ever, when Fani Willis takes the stand, out of breath, angry, yelling at people, pointing fingers. Nathan Wade, the special prosecutor, gets kicked off the case. Fanny sticks for now. Appeals court in Georgia has agreed to review whether she should be disqualified. Man, what's going on with that one?
Ooh, where do you want to start? I mean, I guess I'll start here.
Yeah.
Fanny's testimony in that motion to disqualify was some of the greatest testimony to watch I've ever seen.
Right.
And yes, she did not do well for herself during the testimony. And it is an example that I will show clients in the future of how not to act on a stand. I think at the beginning, let's compare the New York and the Georgia case. So Bragg has not held back his disdain for Trump. And as you pointed out, parts of his campaign were focused on going after the president. But Bragg has stayed out of the light in the actual prosecution of the case. He's been to court only a couple of times, and every time he goes, it's because one of his staff members is testifying and reading tweets and reading call transcripts and, wants to show support. So I think that that's a legitimate reason to be there and send it to your lower level people. Fannie Willis wanting to prosecute the case herself, I mean, it's just a bad look for any elected prosecutor in any office of more than 5 or 6 people. There is a difference between recognizing that you're a political elected official and then using your political designation to basically call favor to go handle a case. She should have stayed 10,000 miles away and never been in her office the day that the case was in court, but she's decided that otherwise. The RICO part that you mentioned is interesting because RICO does have far further implications than just mob bosses, even though the Department of Justice really used the RICO statutes to go after the mob. I think it's a part of the thing that intrigues me about the call to Raffensperger is the statement, the find me the vote. It's a horrible statement. I mean, it is a horrible. I would cringe if I was an attorney representing Trump and heard him say that. I mean, there's no good way to spin that statement. Now, you are right, and I acknowledge that the context of the beginning and the after part of it does have some, bit of relevance. Now, I will say this, I think in the bigger context of things and where the Georgia case gets really interesting to me is there were some efforts to verify the integrity of the election that were more well thought and probably more well taken than others. And when you look at some of the Michigan testimony or some of the Arizona testimony, those sorts of pieces, I think the campaign did not do itself well by pushing as far as they did. And I think some of those pieces are going to come back because they're probably going to be admissible in the Georgia case because, again, we're back to this intent question. There is a fine line, I think, between the rights that a candidate is given or any citizen to ensure the integrity of elections. I think when you start getting into the ballots under the table stuff and the hacking of the software by, Venezuela and some of those other claims that I know Sidney Powell was making, in a circumstantial evidence case, good circumstance and bad circumstance both come in. It really depends upon the jury's interpretation of good versus bad or guilty versus not guilty and how it's going to be presented. And the district attorney's office in Georgia has not done itself well yet in ensuring that the prosecution is going to be one that is at least objectively based. Now, I'm not sure if the ship's so far out at harbor that it can't turn around at this point, but it's probably getting really close. And if I'm Trump in some aspect, I don't know if I want a special prosecutor here, because if you have an opposing counsel who is shown that they're not polished in their presentation, it's a calculated risk, but I might let Fannie run wild and just completely show herself in court and be able to stand up and say, oh, that's great, but none of that's relevant. I mean, that's a tough call to make, but a special prosecutor might come in and say, okay, 2 of these charges are bogus, but the other 2 I can support. And it could very much change the dynamic of the whole case.
Yeah, absolutely. It's gonna be an interesting one to watch again. And the Supreme Court still hasn't spoken on the immunity question about, can you even, if what he's doing while he's president of the United States, they've made the argument he could do literally whatever he wants. And that's still to be determined. Again, this is going to be delayed till after the election, most likely. I don't think that'll see a courtroom. And at that point, does it even matter?
Yeah, I think you're going to see the Supreme Court come out with its immunity opinion in, probably 30 days to 90 days. For people that follow courts and the judicial system, listening to that oral argument was just fascinating. And I think what you're likely to see is the Supreme Court's going to kind of split the baby in half here and differentiate certain items as being, eligible for immunity versus not. And that's where, the dialogue about the murder reference, like you made, it was really interesting in argument, because some of the conservative justices seem to indicate with their questions that they believe that it's an absolute immunity no matter what, because the argument could be made that almost any act is politically motivated. And that's why that's the essence of the immunity protection. But, even people like Roberts and Coney Barrett weren't biting on that argument quite as much. So it's going to be a very long opinion to read, but it's going to be really, really interesting, especially if they split it between absolute and qualified, which they're likely to do. That's going to cause even more chaos, because now you're going to get into an argument of, was the New York payment, were those items that got reported after he became president, did that draw it under the specter or not? Or the Georgia case, because although he was not reelected, you're right, until January, he's still the president. So it's probably just going to cause even more chaos and confusion, if you can even fathom that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then, I thought that the whole aspect of immunity and the limits to it, and talking about whether it's politically motivated or not for an executive, it is fascinating, because, we had conversations in X Spaces about what if a president orders a drone strike within weeks of the election to take out a known terrorist, Osama bin Laden per se, and or just something that creates just such national pride that it boosts his ability to get elected. There's poll changes. Or can a foreign government, can the ICC indict them for murder, saying that what they did was to help them politically in the United States? You really do have to have absolute immunity when you're president of the United States, because you cannot separate the politics from the job, because it is both political and non-political all the time. Everything the president does is political and non-political constantly. I mean, it's impossible to differentiate, unless he shoots somebody, while he's walking around Manhattan, says, I don't like that guy's face. That's an extreme example, but I don't know, man. How do you decide?
Well, but the more philosophical question to me is politics so broken that we can't have trust in whoever is elected? I mean, if you can trust, going back to the fundamentals of the republic, if we can trust and rally behind whomever is elected, then I'm not sure the immunity question is as significant. But with such the polarization today, the reality of it is I don't think we as Americans fully rally behind the person who wins the election. And where we've gotten to is now we don't trust the process. And in those spaces, these immunity questions and all of the other political motivated stuff, it's only going to get worse, because we would have, Jefferson and Franklin never imagined at all that arguments would be where they are today. And it creates an issue for courts and legislatures, because can you now be a strict constructionist as to the Constitution being on a stone tablet, or is it on a rubber sheet that's malleable and changes to where society is today?
It's very interesting on so many aspects, not just this. And I guess the brilliant vision of having a Supreme Court independent of the other two branches, supposedly they answer these constitutional questions. Maybe the Supreme Court's the thing that saves the republic. If you think about it, at the end of the day, they're going to make these decisions, and maybe they can find a way to fit the current situation into the Constitution and give us some clarity. And that's where I'm resting my my hopes for the future of our republic on, because people have to have faith in one of the three institutions. And when the executive's in question, the legislature's in question, we have to rely on the judicial to kind of put everything back in check. And somebody's going to have to be the grown up here in the table. And I'm optimistic that the Supreme Court is going to kind of put the wheels back on and get us moving in the right direction. It's going to be an exciting thing to watch. I can't wait to have you back on. We're going to talk about this from now until November. I'm sure beyond November. But I was so excited to meet you and find somebody that has an objective, brilliant legal opinion. I've enjoyed this conversation so much, both offline and online. You know so many things about so many things. So if anybody, if I can say this, I hope if anybody needs an attorney and you're in Florida or Ohio, the two states are licensed, I hope they call you, because I certainly would. And I really appreciate all of your expert opinions today, and we'll continue to watch it and we'll see how it goes. And I really appreciate your time today.
I appreciate it, David. You know, it's always great to meet new people and, you know, have intelligent banter coming from different perspectives. And our conversations have opened my mind to some things, and my phone's always there for you or anybody else who needs help. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk tonight.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on. And I guess let's all stay tuned.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. There is a lot going on, a lot to discuss, a lot's going to be changing, whether it's this New York case, the Florida case, the Flaaaarida case, the J6 case, the Georgia case. I mean, yes, I can't even believe we're having this conversation. But we will continue to bring you all of the expert analysis, all the different positions. We'll bring you all the opinions without the bias, just so you can stay informed. And I guess stay tuned, because we'll keep doing this as these cases progress, because, I mean, there's a lot of very fascinating things that come out of whether it's Supreme Court or these trial courts, and it's all going to be something we're going to be learning about in law school and talking about for years. 6 months from the election, guys. So stay right here. I will keep talking to you and keep sharing this with you as everything develops. Thanks for watching.